Hi everyone, welcome back today. Thank you for being here. Here's a scene I want you to imagine. You're sitting in a metaphysics class, the kind where people talk about energy healing, consciousness, the self, and inner growth. And a student raises their hand and says, "My ego keeps getting in the way of my learning. I really need to work on that." And the teacher looks back at them and says completely seriously, "Actually, it's really important to have a strong ego." And the student just nods. And you're sitting there thinking, did they just agree? Did they talk entirely past each other? Are they even using the same word? This actually happened to me, and I left the class more confused than I walked in. Because here's the thing, both of them were right. They were just speaking from completely different frameworks, and nobody stopped to acknowledge that. The word ego might be one of the most misunderstood words in the English language. It shows up in psychology, in spirituality, in everyday conversation, and in each context means something completely different, sometimes even opposite. Today, I want to fix that. We're going to trace where this word came from, what it means across different worlds, and why it got so muddled, and then go deeper into what the ego actually is at a philosophical and evolutionary level. This is a 20-minute video covering the core dimensions of the definition, but you could spend a lifetime studying this stuff. But by the end of this, hopefully you'll never be confused by the word ego again. So let's get into it. Let's start at the beginning, the word itself. Ego is Latin. It simply means I. That's it. Not a concept, not a theory, just the first person singular pronoun, I. In the 18th century, the word started migrating into English philosophical writing. Thinkers began using it to describe the self, that which feels, thinks, and acts, the part of you that moves through experience. Immanuel Kant used it to describe a core aspect of self-awareness, the part of the mind that recognizes itself as a subject experiencing the world. So at this point, before psychology even existed as a formal discipline, the ego essentially was a philosophical term for self-awareness and identity. Simple enough, right? Then Freud showed up and things got complicated. Sigmund Freud is the reason most of us know this word at all. In the late 19th and 20th century, he built one of the first systematic models of the human mind, and the ego was the centerpiece of it all. In Freud's model, the mind had three parts. The id, which is your primal animalistic drive, such as pleasure, hunger, desire, survival. The id wants what it wants right now with zero regard for consequences. Then we have the superego, which is your internalized moral code, the voice of your parents, society, and religion. The part of you that says, you shouldn't do that, which generally is a good thing until it becomes too rigid. Think of crushing guilt, perfectionism, and repression. And then there's the ego, which is the mediator sitting between the two, the rational manager. It takes the raw drives of the id and the strict rules of the superego and figures out how to actually function in the real world. In Freud's view, the ego is healthy and necessary. It's what lets you hold a job, maintain relationships, navigate social situations, and delay gratification. A strong ego meant you were psychologically stable, grounded, and functional. That's why a therapist might say, we need to strengthen your ego. They mean you need to develop a more stable, coherent sense of self so you can operate in the world more effectively. Now, before we go any further, I want to pause here because we've established that Freud's ego is a healthy, necessary thing. So why do we say, oh, that guy has such a big ego, like it's a character flaw? Here's linguistic history, and it's actually fascinating. Two words existed before Freud ever wrote a paper. Egoism, meaning acting primarily in self-interest, and egotism, with a T, meaning excessive self-importance or arrogance. Both had negative connotations. Both predated clinical psychology entirely. When Freud's ego entered popular culture, most people didn't even read his actual work. They just heard a word that sounded a lot like egoism, and egotism. Over decades, that meaning blurred together. He has an ego became shorthand for he is an egotist. The psychological term got hijacked by the colloquial one, and then Eastern philosophy poured gasoline all over that fire, but we'll get to that in a moment. Before we leave psychology altogether, I want to spend some time on Carl Jung, because he's actually the bridge between the psychological and spiritual understanding of the ego. Jung agreed with Freud that the ego is the center of conscious awareness, the eye that navigates daily life, but he added a much larger dimension. He said the ego is not the whole self. It's actually a relatively small part of a much bigger psychic system he called the self, with a capital S. The self included the unconscious. What we're talking about is the shadow, the archetypes, the deeper layers of the psyche that most of us never examine. In Jung's model, the ego's job isn't just to manage behavior, it's to eventually enter into a relationship with the deeper self. You've probably heard a lot of people say, I made friends with my ego a long time ago. That idea traces almost directly back to Jung. He called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming more fully aware of who you actually are, beyond the mask you present to the world. This is where psychology starts to sound a lot like spirituality. And that's not a coincidence. Jung was deeply influenced by Eastern philosophy and ancient mystic traditions. He sits right at the intersect of both worlds, and understanding him makes what comes next a lot easier to grasp. In many spiritual traditions, such as Buddhism, certain strands of mysticism, and more recently through teachers like Eckhart Tolle, the ego is understood as something fundamentally different from the psychological definition. Here, the ego is not a healthy mental function. It's a case of mistaken identity. The spiritual ego is the false self, a constructed identity made up of labels, roles, stories, and memories that we mistaken for who we actually are, such as your nationality, your wounds, your achievements, and so forth. The ongoing story of my life that you're constantly telling yourself inside of your head. These traditions say you are not the thoughts and stories in your head. Think of it like a movie. You're not the character on the screen. You're the actor playing that character. You're not the story. You're the one the story is happening to. Eckhart Tolle puts it this way. The ego is the voice in the head that never stops talking, the constant narrator that labels, judges, compares, and worries. People believe they are it, the voice. The spiritual work is simply to notice that you can observe the voice, and the observer can't be the same thing it's observing. Here's a simple way to feel that distinction. If you can observe a rock, see its colors, its shape, its weight, you can't be the rock at the same time. Observing and being are two different things. The same thing goes for your thoughts. If you can watch a thought arise and fade away, you aren't that thought. You're the one watching. You can let thoughts pass through without grabbing onto them, acting on them, or deciding that they're you. Now here's where it gets practical, and where most people don't realize this is already happening in their lives. The voice in their head just doesn't narrate your thoughts, it narrates you. It's constantly building a story of who you are, such as I am a marketing director, I am successful, I am someone who has their life together. Those are just descriptions. They're thoughts, mental labels your mind has generated and then identified with them. Here's the bridge. A job title feels like a fact in the world, and you believe you are that title, that it defines your worth, your identity, your place in things, and that lives entirely in your head. It's a story the voice in your head is telling. And when you're fused with that story, you don't even notice it's there. It just feels like reality. So what happens when you lose the job? Objectively, you no longer have that position. That's it. But it doesn't feel like that at all. It feels like catastrophe, like something essential about you has been taken away. That's the ego at work. It has fused your identity with that title. So when that role disappears, your ego experiences a kind of death. This is the mechanism these traditions are pointing to. It's not that loss is painless. Loss is definitely real, but the ego amplifies every loss into an existential crisis because it's staked your entire identity on things that are, by their nature, temporary. Jobs end, relationships end, bodies age, and so forth. Buddhism calls this attachment. Eckhart Tolle calls it identification. The labels differ, but the observation is the same. We suffer not simply because bad things happen, but because we're rigidly identified with things that were never permanently ours to begin with. So now let's put both frameworks side by side, because this is the sentence I wish someone had told me years ago. Psychology wants to repair and strengthen the ego so you can function well in the world. Spirituality wants you to see through the ego so you can experience a reality beyond your individual story. Same word, completely different goals. Both legitimate, both useful, and almost never clarified in the same conversation, which is exactly why people end up talking past each other. When you know which framework someone is speaking from, what they're saying suddenly starts to make complete sense. Without that context, you're just lost. Now, here's what really shifted something for me personally. Understanding not just what the ego is, but where it came from. Because once I understood this, so much of my behavior started to make sense in ways that never had before. And the answer is evolution. The ego, at its core, is a survival program, and a remarkably sophisticated one. Think about it this way. A plant doesn't need an ego. It absorbs sunlight and water from its immediate environment, entirely self-sustaining where it stands. But we're not plants. We have to go out into the world and find resources that are external to us, such as food, water, shelter, and mates. Survival required action in an environment of constant scarcity. Over hundreds of thousands of years, that constant biological hunger, always needing more food, more shelter, more safety, well, it got baked into the way we think about ourselves. Some researchers in shame and evolutionary psychology have suggested that the feeling of not having enough eventually became the feeling of not being enough. That scarcity that once lived out in the world got turned inward and made into a story about who we are. And once you feel like you're not enough, the only logical response is to go out there and prove that you are, through titles, statuses, achievement, and things. The ego became a machine of acquisition. That's more of a theory than a hard science, but it's a theory that might feel uncomfortably familiar. Another function that emerged was a boundary drawing mechanism. Survival depends on knowing where you end and the rest of the world begins. For example, what's a threat to you? What belongs to you? What can harm you? So the brain developed a sharp, persistent sense of me versus everything else. And over millennia, what started as a purely physical distinction, my body versus the environment, gradually became a psychological one. Me versus you, my group versus yours, my belief versus theirs, and so forth. That hardwired sense of separation that spirituality keeps pointing to, which is the root of all human suffering, this is where it comes from. As human societies grew more complex, the ego added another layer, social tracking. Who has status? Who's a threat? Who's an ally? Humans evolved as intensely social animals. Being exiled from the tribe was essentially a death sentence. So the ego developed a kind of social mask, a persona crafted to keep you acceptable, valuable, and safe within the group. And finally, the ego is a pattern recognition and threat prediction system. It stores painful thoughts, not out of cruelty, but out of function. It's trying to prevent you from repeating dangerous mistakes. It runs simulations, anticipates threats, and plans responses. For example, how many times have you mentally rehearsed a confrontation with someone, playing it out from every angle, only to have that conversation never happen, like never even come close? The ego wraps all of this biological machinery in a single narrative, the story of my life. And here's the punchline. That wiring hasn't fundamentally changed. We're running essentially the same software we ran on the savannah, but in a completely different world. Instead of competing for food and mates, we're competing for followers, salaries, status, and Lamborghinis. Same drives, different costumes. So where does this leave us? If you're working with a therapist, building confidence, trying to function better in your relationships and career, you're strengthening the ego, and that's good and necessary. You're learning to manage the operating system more skillfully. If you're on a spiritual path, meditating, questioning the nature of the self, trying to reduce suffering, you're working to see through the ego, to loosen your grip on the accumulated stories and labels and ask, who is actually aware of this all? Who am I? And here's something worth sitting with. Some teachers suggest you need a strong ego first before you can truly transcend it. The stability has to be there before you can start questioning it. Both paths, as it turns out, might be a part of the same longer journey. The practical takeaway is simple. The next time you're in a conversation about ego, growth, or the self, notice which framework you're actually speaking from. Otherwise, you're just a student and that teacher in a metaphysics class using the same word and talking past each other entirely. The confusion around the word ego isn't just semantics. It has real consequences for how we understand ourselves, how we talk about growth, and how we relate to each other. So, who would have thought that the Latin word for I could generate so much complexity? But then again, of course it did. The question of who and what we are is perhaps the oldest question in human history. So, if you have found this useful, share it with someone who's also been confused in a conversation about ego, which honestly is probably a lot of people out there. And let me know in the comments, which framework do you find yourself working from the most? The psychological, the spiritual, or somewhere in between? I genuinely would love to know. Remember to tune in, listen deeply, shift completely, and bloom. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.